Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of just absolute precision. It's almost like engineering.
Right, yeah. It's very mechanical.
Exactly. You fall off your bike, you break your arm, and the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points at the screen and says, well, there it is. There's the problem.
It's incredibly binary. I
Yeah.
mean, the bone is broken or it is not broken.
Yeah.
It's a very clean narrative.
And it's deeply comforting. We desperately like things to be visible like that. We want them to be categorized, put in a neat little box so we can fix them.
Yeah, humans love a box.
We really do. But then you step into the world of human behavior, neurodevelopment, trauma, how we process information, and suddenly that X-ray machine is completely broken. You're looking at this diagnostic landscape that is, well, honestly, it's incredibly murky.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters.
Hmm.
And today we are diving straight into those waters. We're going to explore exactly how reality gets edited because, we are not passive receivers of the world around us.
Right.
We are actively constructing it, processing it, and sometimes, frankly, completely distorting it.
And we're going to trace that entire process today. We're starting from the deep, hidden trauma networks within your own individual mind. Then we want to look at what happens when millions of those minds get together, moving outward to the societal narratives that get constructed by our media.
Which is a whole other level of complexity.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And from there, we have to navigate the incredibly hostile battlegrounds of social media algorithms. And ultimately, we're going to look at how true creativity and trustworthy knowledge might just be the only tools we have to break out of these rigid structures.
It sounds like a massive journey, honestly. Going from a single traumatized mind to a highly polarized digital society. But the through line connecting all of our sources for this deep dive is strikingly clear.
Yeah, it really is.
It is all about the architecture of human behavior. It's about how information, whether that's a terrifying sensory experience in your past, or a news story on your television, or a toxic digital post on your feed, how all of that is processed, filtered, and categorized by humans.
And we have a truly fascinating stack of materials to help us build this understanding. We're pulling from therapeutic frameworks for clinical trauma healing, specifically from a school of healing arts that trains therapists.
Which has some incredible insights.
Yeah. And then we've got a rigorous academic media analysis by a researcher named Faru Yilmaz, looking at exactly how ethnic minorities are constructed in the press. We've got political science research from Professor Michael Bang-Peterson on social media hostility. And finally, some brilliant insights from leading professors via the Universität on creativity and the vital need for what they call lighthouses of truth in our new AI era.
It's a dense stack, but the implications for how we live our daily lives are profound.
Really profound. So to set the stage for you as you're listening to this, I want you to imagine your brain as a film director. And this director is constantly in an editing room, cutting and splicing the raw footage of your daily life.
I love this analogy.
Thanks. So sometimes that director experiences a scene so terrible they just lock it away in a vault. Sometimes society forces the director to put a weird biased color filter over the lens. And sometimes social media algorithms just burst into the editing room, steal the most dramatic, hostile clips, and play them on an endless loop to keep you agitated.
Just absolute chaos in the editing room.
Exactly. And today we are walking right into that room. We want to see exactly how the final cut of your reality gets made.
I think that film director analogy is the perfect place to start, because before we can possibly understand how we interact with the chaotic, overwhelming world out there on a societal level, we have to understand how our internal world processes difficult experiences.
Right, we have to start at the source.
We have to begin with the individual mind.
So let's start there, the inner architecture. We are drawing from the course materials of the Skolen for Hellingskunst, or the School of Healing Arts. This is run by an integrative psychotherapist named Nicholas Thrain.
Right.
They offer these intensive modules for therapists, teaching them how to actually heal trauma. And right off the bat, the very first thing they do is define trauma in a way that completely challenged how I normally use the word.
Yes, the clinical definition they use in this framework is absolutely crucial. They state explicitly that trauma is not the event that occurred in a specific situation.
Which sounds counterintuitive at first.
It does. But they say that trauma is the imprint that arose in the mind as a consequence of what happened.
Okay, hold on, because this completely changes how I think about a traumatic event. Usually, if someone is in a terrible car crash or experiences something violent, we point to the event and say, well, that was the trauma.
Right.
But this framework is saying, no, the twisted metal, the physical impact, the actual moment in time, that isn't the trauma itself.
Precisely. The event is external. The trauma is internal. The trauma is an adaptation. It is a biological and psychological response to something that was completely overwhelming to the human system at that specific moment in time.
Wow. Okay.
Think about it from the therapist's perspective. When they're sitting in a room working with a client, they cannot actually change the past event. The car crash happened. The abuse happened. That is a fixed point in history.
You can't rewrite history.
Exactly.
Okay.
What the therapist can work with is that internal imprint. They're working with the lingering network of memories, the bodily sensations, and the intense protective mechanisms that the mind built around that event.
And this brings us to a concept they use called den Rudtrad, which translates to the red thread. The source material notes that clients rarely arrive at a therapist's door with a neat, tidy narrative saying, hello, I have an unhealed imprint from 1998 that needs resolving.
If only it were that simple.
Right. Instead, they arrive in a tangled mess.
A deeply tangled, painful mess.
Yeah.
The symptoms can be incredibly varied and seem completely disconnected from one another.
What kind of symptoms are we talking about?
The text specifically lists things like uncontrollable crying spells, intense fear when left alone, a sudden increased use of substances or alcohol to cope, chronic sleep problems, lashing out angrily at partners, severe procrastination.
Procrastination, really.
Yeah, severe procrastination, or even physical somatic reactions. We're talking about unexplainable stomach aches, chronic muscle tension, and debilitating migraines.
So a client might just walk into the clinic saying, I have these terrible migraines, I can't sleep, and my marriage is falling apart because I keep yelling at my spouse.
Yes, exactly.
They are presenting the surface level chaos, but the therapist's entire job is to find that red thread. They have to trace those seemingly random, chaotic present-day symptoms back into the past because this framework insists they are inextricably linked to past events.
But the course emphasizes that tracing this thread is incredibly difficult. It requires the therapist and the client to navigate through what they describe as the foggy, unknown, and unbearable parts of the psyche. You're essentially walking into the dark.
Which means you need a very specific map. And the source talks a lot about case conceptualization. It's not just about spotting a bad memory. It's about mapping the entire trauma network. Can you walk me through how they actually do that? Because it sounds like diffusing a bomb. You can't just start cutting wires.
That's a great way to put it. You definitely cannot just dive into the deepest, darkest vault on day one of therapy.
That would just make things worse, right?
Oh, absolutely. That would overwhelm the client system all over again. It's a process called re-traumatization. Case conceptualization is about the therapist figuring out which underlying traumas are important to process and, critically, in what order to process them to get the most healing effect safely.
So there's an order of operations here.
Yes. They have to establish what the training calls Palamerker landmarks, or beacons. These are moments of safety and stability established in the present, which give the client hope and trust. The text calls these landmarks invaluable jewels in the healing process.
So once they have that map and they've found those safe landmarks, how do they actually do the healing? Because the school teaches a few specific therapeutic methodologies, and one of the major ones they highlight is called parts work.
The underlying premise of parts work is fascinating. It posits that the human mind isn't just a single, unified monolith.
Like, we aren't just one solid block of identity.
Right. The mind has different parts, almost like different subpersonalities or protective mechanisms, and these parts can actually be in intense conflict with one another, holding different functions.
The source says that to protect us from the unbearable, the things we just cannot process at the time the trauma happens, these parts gather together and create what they call time pockets, or Tidslammer.
Yes. Let's go back to your film director analogy.
Okay, let's do it.
The director is filming the documentary of your life, and suddenly they experience a scene that is simply too horrific, too biologically overwhelming for the main narrative of the film. If they leave it in, the whole production shuts down.
Right, the system overloads.
So what does the director do? They cut the scene out. They put that raw, terrifying footage into a separate canister. They seal it up, and they lock it in a time pocket in the back of the editing room.
But the film still has a massive unexplained gap in it. And that canister is still sitting in the editing room. It doesn't cease to exist just because it's locked up.
No, it doesn't.
Over time, it's taking up space, maybe leaking some weird toxic chemicals into the rest of the room.
Exactly. The mind's ability to compartmentalize is an absolutely brilliant survival mechanism in the short term. It is what allows an individual to keep functioning.
It's how people survive the unimaginable.
Right. It allows them to go to work the next day, to keep raising their kids, to survive a war zone, despite having experienced something totally unbearable.
Yeah.
But it's ultimately limiting. The text highlights that the biological and psychological energy required to keep those time pockets sealed is immense.
So you are literally using up your own battery life just to keep the vault door shut.
Exactly. Which is why the text says that using parts work to gently give these silence parts a voice, again, releases massive amounts of life energy.
Okay, but when you say the therapist talks to a part, what does that actually look like in the room? Do they literally ask the client to imagine a different person sitting next to them? Like an empty chair?
It varies, but essentially, yes. The therapist might ask the client to focus on that feeling of intense anger or that sensation of a tight chest and ask, if that part of you had a voice, what is it trying to say?
Oh, wow.
Or how old does that part of you feel? Often the client will realize that the part holding the anger or fear feels like a 6-year-old child.
That is wild.
And then the therapist helps the adult client validate and speak to that 6-year-old part.
Right.
You're identifying the guard at the vault door, thanking them for protecting you all these years, but letting them know the danger has passed.
That is incredibly profound, and it ties directly into another key methodology they teach, which sounds a bit more physiological, called bilateral stimulation. The course material describes this as a way to help heal trauma, specifically from neglect and abuse. But the mechanism behind it, how it actually works in the brain, is so interesting to me.
It is deeply tied to neurobiology and how memory functions. In therapies like EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which utilizes bilateral stimulation, the goal is to help the brain process those stuck, unfiled memories.
The text says that while a part of a client's attention is occupied by sensory stimulation, the otherwise unbearable impressions from a traumatizing situation can gradually flow into awareness and be processed.
Right.
But mechanically, how does that happen?
Think about how the brain's defense mechanisms work. When a traumatic memory is triggered, the amygdala, the brain's alarm system, sounds a massive threat response.
Right, the sirens go off.
The brain literally thinks the trauma is happening again right now. It goes into fight, flight, or freeze.
Whoa.
The logical part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, goes offline. That's why you can't just think your way out of a flashback.
Right, because the guard at the vault door has pulled the fire alarm. You can't just reason with a fire alarm.
Exactly. So how do you bypass the guard? You overwhelm the brain's working memory in a very specific, safe way.
How so?
By introducing a rhythmic, alternating sensory input, like having the client track the therapist's fingers moving side to side with her eyes, or alternating physical taps on the left and right knees, you are demanding the brain's attention in the present moment.
Okay.
The working memory only has so much bandwidth. Because the brain is so busy processing this left, right sensory input in the safety of the clinic room, it literally doesn't have the spare capacity to trigger the full-blown, overwhelming panic response.
Wow. So it's almost like you're giving the mind a fidget spinner.
Yes.
You're occupying the anxious, guarded part of the brain with a simple task so the adults in the room can finally sit down, open the vault, and sort through the messy paperwork of the memory.
I love the fidget spinner analogy. That is spot on. The source material describes it as building a bridge between present-day bodily sensations and the episodic traumatic events of the past. It allows the unbearable to become bearable.
That makes so much sense.
The client can finally look at that raw, terrifying footage from the canister without feeling like they are physically back inside the horrific scene. They are watching it from the safety of the present, which allows the hippocampus to finally file the memory away as a past event, rather than keeping it actively hidden in a time pocket as a current threat.
Okay, hold on, because this raises a really fundamental question about the human experience. Let's unpack this. If trauma is just an imprint in the mind rather than the event itself, and if our brains have these elaborate built-in mechanisms to create time pockets and compartmentalize reality,
Right.
doesn't that mean two people can experience the exact same horrific event? Let's say they were in the exact same violent car crash, but only one of them walks away traumatized. What does that tell us about human resilience?
That is the most crucial, liberating insight of this entire framework.
Yes.
Two people can experience the exact same horrific event sitting in the same car with vastly different psychological outcomes.
That blows my mind.
It tells us that resilience isn't just about avoiding bad things in life. It's about the internal resources, the attachment styles, and the processing mechanisms a person has at their disposal when the bad thing inevitably happens.
The course mentions teaching therapists to map a client's unconscious attachment contract and assess their resources. So you're saying if a person has a strong internal foundation and critically a safe environment to go home to after the crash, their mind might just process the terrifying imprint naturally.
Yes.
The director edits the scene, puts it in the final film, and moves on.
Exactly. The memory of the crash remains terrible, but it becomes just that, a memory. It doesn't become a trauma. But if they don't have those resources, or if they're in an environment where it isn't safe to process the fear, the mind has no choice. It resorts to time pockets.
So our individual minds are constantly actively constructing our reality. We aren't passive video recorders. We filter, we categorize, we lock things away, all to protect our internal system and maintain a sense of order and safety.
And this is where the through line of our deep dive becomes incredibly clear. What is fascinating here is how this internal mechanism of filtering and categorizing reality to protect ourselves perfectly mirrors what we do on a macro societal level.
Oh, wow. Yeah. We just scale it up.
We just scale it up. The individual mind uses time pockets and parts work to manage internal chaos. Our societies use media narratives and linguistic categories to manage external chaos.
If the individual brain is doing all this complex editing to protect itself from trauma, I can't help but wonder what happens when you put millions of these film directors together. Do we do this on a societal scale?
We absolutely do.
That brings us to our next major source. We are moving from the individual editing room of the mind to the massive broadcasting tower of society. And to do this, we are diving into a rigorous academic media analysis by Farouk Yilmaz titled The Construction of Ethnic Minorities: The Elite, the Media, and the Ethnicization of the Danish Debate.
Now, before we unpack Yilmaz's work, it is vital to establish a clear framework for you as you listen. We are transitioning into discussing political and societal topics, specifically regarding immigration and minority integration in Denmark.
Right, and we need an impartiality check here.
Yes, our role in this deep dive is not to take a political stance. We are not here to advocate for a left-wing or a right-wing perspective on immigration policy.
Absolutely not. Think of us as mechanics looking at a massive societal engine. We just want to see how the gears turn. We are strictly, impartially reporting on the analytical framework provided in Yilmaz's research to understand how the media constructs reality.
We are examining the mechanics of the discourse, not endorsing a specific political ideology.
Exactly. So where does Yilmaz begin?
Yilmaz starts by pointing out a major fundamental flaw in traditional media critique. Usually when people study how minorities are portrayed in the press, they take a purely quantitative approach. They literally just count up the stories.
Right. They look at a newspaper for a month and say, look, there are 50 negative stories about immigrant crime or unemployment, and only 10 positive stories about successful integration or cultural festivals. See? The media is biased.
And they assume that the solution is just to push for more positive stories to balance the scales. But Yilmaz argues this entirely misses the point.
How so?
The real issue isn't the ratio of positive to negative stories. The real issue is what he calls the discursive construction of minorities as an essentialized outgroup.
Okay, let me pause you right there. A centralized outgroup, that sounds like heavy sociology jargon. Can we break that down? You just mean that the media stops seeing these people as complex individual human beings and starts seeing them as a single homogeneous monolith, right?
That is exactly what it means.
Like turning a diverse group of people into a two-dimensional cartoon character.
Yes. Essentializing means assuming that everyone in a particular category shares the exact same inherent unchangeable traits. An outgroup simply means they are defined fundamentally as not us.
So the boundary is drawn before the story even starts.
The very framework of the debate, the language used before a single positive or negative fact is even reported, is already flawed because it relies on this binary categorization.
And this leads to something Yilmaz highlights that I found totally mind-blowing. We can call it the positive story trap.
This is such a great example.
He gives this perfect historical example from a 1999 news segment on a Danish TV station. The journalist is going out into the field with a specific agenda to prove that Danes actually do want to hire immigrants, contrary to the popular negative belief at the time.
Okay.
So the camera crew goes to a care facility, and they interview an older Danish man. He is asked if it's a problem that he has an immigrant working as his home helper. The older man smiles warmly and says, "No, not at all. I'm very happy with it."
Now, on the surface, traditional media researchers, the ones just counting the stories, would categorize this as a definitively positive story.
Oh, completely.
It shows harmony, it shows an immigrant working, contributing to society, and being accepted. It feels like a win for representation. But Yilmaz asks us to look much closer. He asks us to look at the unstated premise, the underlying assumption that makes the story newsworthy in the first place.
Right. I was thinking about this when reading the source. Why on earth is it a national news story that an elderly man likes his home helper?
Exactly.
That shouldn't be news. It is only a story because the baseline assumption of the entire society is that immigrants are naturally a burden, and their access to the labor market must be heavily regulated and constantly debated.
The story functions as an argument against the widespread attitude of immigrants as a burden. But here is the trap. In making that positive argument, the journalist completely accepts and reinforces the underlying premise that immigrants are a distinct, separate, problematic group whose very presence requires justification.
It reinforces the binary of us and them, even while trying to say something nice about them.
Precisely. When the media talks about ethnic minorities in these contexts, they aren't just describing a neutral demographic fact, like saying people with brown hair.
Right.
They're actively constructing a group based on a set of fragmented, historically consistent stereotypes, metaphors, and assumptions. This construction has serious consequences because it artificially limits how we are allowed to categorize people in our minds.
To explain how this mechanism works day to day, Yilmaz introduces two incredibly powerful concepts: ethnicization and de-ethnicization.
These are key to his whole argument.
Let's start with ethnicization. From what I understand, this is when the media attributes negative individual actions to the whole group's inherent traits. So if a local majority demographic teenager steals a bike, the media frames it as teen rebellion or an isolated incident.
Yeah, boys will be boys.
Right. But if a minority teenager steals a bike, the media frames it as a failure of their entire culture or ethnicity. The individual is stripped of their individuality and trapped as a prisoner of these generalized group traits. Is that right?
That is exactly how ethnicization functions. It makes the negative behavior an inherent property of the group identity. But the inverse of this, de-ethnicization, is perhaps even more subtle and insidious.
Yes, the source gives an amazing example of this. Yilmaz cites a newspaper article from 1995 describing a young girl with a Turkish background.
Oh, the genes example.
Yes, the journalist is trying to write a glowing, positive profile of her. They describe her outfit in intense detail, calling it the perfect integration. Faded jeans with frayed edges, a modest white shirt, and black boots. The journalist literally writes, "The clothes fit perfectly. Danish and teenage-like."
Focus on those faded genes. It is such a specific, intentional visual choice by the writer.
It really is. But when you analyze what is happening rhetorically, it's wild. The journalist is actively constructing the modern represented by the genes in direct opposition to the ethnic.
Yes.
The unspoken assumption here is that her ethnic identity is a fixed, traditional, backward category. Therefore, by acting modern, by wearing jeans, she is framed as departing from her heritage. She is, quote, becoming Danish.
Her success as an individual, her integration, is framed as a shedding of her ethnicity. She can only be good if she stops being them and starts being us.
So wait, when the journalist praises the girl in the jeans, here's where it gets really interesting. It's almost like listening to a rigged sports commentary.
How do you mean?
Imagine a commentator talking about a player on the opposing visiting team. Even when the commentator is heavily praising the player, saying, "Wow, look at that amazing play, he's moving just like one of our guys," the compliment itself proves she doesn't really belong on the home team. The praise reinforces the boundary line between the teams.
That is an excellent analogy. The compliment validates the commentator's team, the majority culture, as the ultimate standard of excellence, while marking the other player as an anomaly who is only valuable because they mimic that standard.
It's a compliment that actually distances you.
Exactly. And Yilmaz points out that the media constantly views itself as a perfectly objective mirror of reality. News directors will defend their coverage by saying, "We don't create reality, we just reflect the conflicts that already exist in society."
But Yilmaz is saying they aren't just reflecting, they are actively constructing a specific version of reality. We are back to the film director in the editing room.
Yes, we are.
The media isn't showing us the raw, unedited CCTV footage of society. They are cutting scenes, they are adding a dramatic soundtrack, they are choosing which angles to show, and they are applying a specific color filter. And Yilmaz argues this editing process is based on shared ideological assumptions, what he calls an elite consensus.
Yes, the elite consensus. This is the shared agreement among politicians, expert commentators and journalists on what the real issues are and what language is acceptable to use when discussing them. This consensus dictates the entire framework of the public debate.
And when someone tries to point this out, when a critic steps up and says, hey, wait a minute, the very categories we're using to debate this are flawed, they are often shut down by very specific rhetorical strategies.
They get boxed out immediately.
Yilmaz explicitly mentions how the term political correctness was weaponized. He notes it emerged heavily in the late 80s and 90s as a tool to silence critique.
It is a brilliant rhetorical trap. If you question the premise of the debate, or if you point out the subtle bias in a positive story, you are immediately accused of being politically correct. You are framed as an unrealistic idealist who is trying to censor language and who refuses to see the real problems facing society.
It shuts down the conversation before it even starts.
It is a highly effective way to stop any deep discussion about how these minority categories are being discursively constructed in the first place.
It really is a trap. If you argue angrily against the negative stories, you get labeled politically correct and overly sensitive. If you celebrate the positive stories, you accidentally reinforce the us versus them binary.
You can't win.
It makes me wonder, how often do you and I, as everyday consumers of news, just blindly accept the underlying premise of a story just because the story itself seems positive or fair on the surface? We swallow the hook completely because the bait looks so good.
We do it constantly because the framing is largely invisible to us unless we actively look for it. But this brings us to a critical, terrifying transition in our journey today.
Right. Because if traditional media, with all of its professional editors, its journalistic gatekeepers, and its ethical codes of conduct, has still been subtly shaping our reality with these binary, rigid frames for decades.
Yes. What happens next?
What on earth happens when you remove those gatekeepers entirely? What happens when you smash the editing room, give everyone on the planet a microphone, and connect them all via a global algorithmic broadcasting platform?
It explodes. It becomes incredibly volatile.
Welcome to the digital battleground. We are moving from the structured, elite consensus narrative of traditional media to the absolute, unfiltered chaos of social media.
And to guide us through this, we are looking at some fascinating research from Michael Bang Peterson, who is a professor of political science at Aarhus University. This is part of a massive project called Macroscopic 2.0, which essentially studies the structures of power and democracy.
Okay, to understand the stakes here, we first have to look at the scale of the shift. The research notes that 68% of the entire Danish population gets their weekly political news via social media.
Almost 70%.
That's a massive majority.
And for young people, it's even more pronounced. It is their primary, sometimes only, source of news. The digital public square is no longer just a niche forum for tech enthusiasts. It is the dominant arena for all political and societal conversation.
But the experience inside that digital arena is, for a huge number of people, deeply, deeply unpleasant. The source notes that 88% of Danes have seen others subjected to hateful, aggressive comments on Facebook.
Yeah, that's almost everyone.
It feels like an always accessible, always connected world of pure hostility and misinformation. But here is the massive twist in Professor Peterson's research. The reasons why social media is so hostile are completely contrary to what we usually assume.
Exactly. The prevailing narrative, the story we all tell ourselves, is what psychologists call the mismatch hypothesis.
Okay, what is that?
The idea is that normal, decent, everyday people log on to Facebook or X. The anonymity of the internet, the physical distance of the screens, the lack of immediate physical consequences, it strips away their empathy. The technology essentially transforms these normal people into hateful, vicious trolls.
Right. The classic line is, they would never say that to my face in the supermarket. It's the internet making them mean.
But Professor Peterson's research debunks that entirely. The technology is not turning good people bad.
This blew my mind when I read it. The people who are incredibly hostile online are also incredibly hostile in face-to-face political debates. They actually would scream that at you in the supermarket. The research even found that these highly hostile online users are slightly overrepresented in criminal records.
It correlates strongly with pre-existing antisocial personality traits. The hostility doesn't originate in the social media algorithm. It originates in the psychology of the user. They are predisposed to this aggressive, dominant behavior before they ever log on.
So the platform just gives them a bigger megaphone.
Social media just gives them a bigger megaphone.
But wait, that statistic doesn't quite make sense to me on a macro level. If social media isn't magically turning us all into monsters, why does it feel like the entire internet is overflowing with hate? If it's just a few bad apples, why is the whole barrel rotten?
This brings us to what the research calls the 1% rule. And this is where the mechanics of social media truly distort our reality.
Okay, walk me through this rule because the numbers are staggering.
The research shows that 10% of users make 90% of all posts. So immediately the conversation is dominated by a highly active minority.
Right, most people are just lurking.
But it gets crazier. When it comes to the hostility we were just talking about, just 1% of the total users generate 90% of all the hostile, hateful messages.
Just 1%. I mean, that is wild.
Let's visualize that to understand how it warps our perception. Imagine a massive sports stadium with 10,000 people in it. The vast majority of the crowd, 9,000 people, are just sitting there quietly watching the game, scrolling on their phones, maybe occasionally whispering to the person next to them.
Okay, I can picture that.
Then you have 900 people who are talking at a normal volume, cheering normally.
Yeah.
But down the front row, there are 100 people, just 1% of the stadium, who have smuggled in massive military-grade megaphones.
Oh, boy.
And they are screaming obscenities, threats, and hostility at the top of their lungs, nonstop, for the entire game.
If you were sitting anywhere in that stadium, your entire experience of the event would be defined by the screaming of those 100 people. You would walk out thinking, wow, that crowd was insanely aggressive, even though 9,900 people were behaving completely normally.
Exactly. It distorts our entire perception of reality. We log online, we see the megaphones, and we think the world is angry. But it's really just a tiny, highly active minority of superspreaders. And understanding this completely shatters another very popular myth, the idea of the echo chamber.
Oh, this is fascinating. We hear all the time that social media is bad because it traps us in echo chambers where we only hear from people we agree with.
But the research points out that the biggest echo chamber we live in is actually our offline life.
Wait, really?
Think about it. We actively self-sort in physical reality. We live in neighborhoods with people of similar incomes. We work with people of similar educational backgrounds. We choose to hang out with friends who share our interests and political leanings. Our physical lives are highly curated, very comfortable echo chambers.
Oh, that is so true.
And social media does the exact opposite. Social media violently pops the physical echo chamber.
Because everyone is suddenly in the same room.
Right. It exposes us directly to that loud, hostile 1% that we would actively, naturally avoid in our offline lives. It creates visible friction because we are suddenly intimately seeing the arguments and aggression of people who exist entirely outside our normal physical social circles.
Yeah.
We are in an echo chamber online. We are in a mosh pit.
A digital mosh pit. That is such a vivid way to describe it. And this exact same dynamic, the 1% megaphone effect, applies to misinformation as well, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Because after the 2016 U.S. elections, fake news became the ultimate boogeyman. It was blamed for everything. But again, the research shows that misinformation isn't nearly as widespread as the media panic suggests. During the 2016 election, links to known verified misinformation domains made up only about 0.001% of all posts on Twitter.
That is vanishingly small.
Almost non-existent.
And just like the hostility, the sharing of this misinformation is driven by a tiny minority of superspreaders who possess those same antisocial personality traits. They aren't sharing fake news because they are innocent victims who've been completely brainwashed by Russian bots.
Right.
They are sharing it purposefully because they have an intense dislike for people with opposing political views. They are intentionally throwing digital grenades into the public square just to cause chaos and trigger the other side.
There is a wild example of this in the Danish research regarding the COVID-19 pandemic. They tracked the spread of misinformation about face masks, and they found that half of the misinformation shared online wasn't shared by conspiracy theorists believing it.
Who was sharing it then?
It was actually shared by people who were mocking it or arguing against it.
Oh, wow.
They saw something totally absurd, shared it with their followers, say, look how stupid these people are, and inadvertently fueled the viral spread of the very thing they hated.
That is the ultimate irony. And why did they do that? Why can't we just ignore the absurd and the hostile? This taps deeply into human biology.
Oh, right, the negativity bias.
Yeah.
Yes. Humans have a built-in negativity bias. We are evolutionarily hardwired to pay intense attention to threats, to conflicts, and to anomalies in our environment. Thousands of years ago, if you didn't pay attention to the rustling in the bushes, you got eaten by the tiger. It's a survival mechanism.
The research compares it to rubbernecking at a car crash on the highway. Even if the crash is safely over on the other side of the median and poses zero threat to you, traffic still slows to a crawl because people physically cannot resist looking at the wreckage.
Right.
It's dangerous, it's unpleasant, you don't want to look, but your brain demands that you assess the threat.
And this is exactly where the algorithms come into play. People often blame the algorithm for creating the hate. But the algorithms don't necessarily create the hostility out of thin air. The hostility comes from the 1%.
Right.
But algorithms are designed with one singular goal: to maximize engagement, to keep you on the platform as long as possible so they can serve you ads.
And what drives human engagement more effectively than anything else? Our biological negativity bias.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The machine learning models quickly realize that we pause our scrolling, we click, we comment, and we share when we are presented with conflict, anger, and shock. We rubberneck.
They figured out the cheat code for the human brain.
They really did. So the algorithm takes the toxic content generated by that 1% and it prioritizes it. It intentionally pushes it to the very top of the feeds of the passive 99% because it knows we can't look away.
It is a totally toxic symbiosis. The 1% provides the venom, our biology reacts involuntarily to the venom, and the algorithm optimizes the delivery system to make sure we get dosed as often as possible.
That's a dark but accurate way to put it.
But this has massive, tangible democratic consequences. The research states that 64% of Danes, nearly two-thirds of the country, want to withdraw from online debate entirely because of this hostility.
That is the real existential danger to democracy here. The loud, antisocial minority is effectively bullying the quiet, moderate majority completely out of the public square.
Driving everyone else away.
When normal citizens withdraw because it's too exhausting and toxic, the digital space is left entirely to the extremists, which then further distorts our perception of society, making it seem even more polarized than it actually is. Furthermore, the research notes that even if people don't actively fall for the fake news, the constant overwhelming exposure to it and the constant traditional media panic about fake news breeds a generalized, paralyzing cynicism.
It just makes you doubt everything. You just throw your hands up.
Yes, it lowers overall trust in all information, even from legitimate, highly verified sources.
Okay, I have to push back here. I really do. Because if we know all of this, if the researchers know it's literally just 1% of users causing 90% of the democratic damage and driving people off the platforms, why is it so hard to just kick them off?
It's a fair question.
I mean, if 100 people are ruining the stadium for 10,000, the security guards just throw them out? Problem solved? Why don't the platforms just ban the 1%?
It seems like an obvious solution, but if we connect this to the bigger picture of global platform governance, it is incredibly complex and fraught with unintended consequences. First, deplatforming isn't a magic wand. When you ban these highly motivated antisocial activists, they don't just disappear.
Where do they go?
They often migrate to darker, unmoderated corners of the internet alternative platforms where there is absolutely no counter-narrative, no moderate voices at all. In those spaces, they can radicalize much further and faster.
But they have the data. The tech companies know exactly who the 1% are. They track every click. It sounds to me like they're just choosing engagement and profit over democracy. They don't want to ban their most active users.
There is certainly an economic incentive for engagement, yes, but it's also a legal and philosophical minefield. Much of what feels intensely hostile, toxic, and damaging to our mental health isn't actually illegal.
Right. Being a jerk isn't illegal.
Exactly. Being a jerk isn't a crime. It is awful. But in many jurisdictions, it is protected speech. If platforms start aggressively banning people just for being hostile but not breaking the law, you enter a massive debate about corporate censorship and who gets to define what is too hostile.
And the tech companies themselves are these massive, completely opaque black boxes. We don't actually know how the algorithm is weighting that speech.
Exactly. The source material makes a profound comparison here to help us grasp the scale of the problem. The large social media platforms, with their billions of users and completely opaque, ever-shifting algorithms, are arguably some of the most complex social systems ever created in human history.
That's a terrifying thought.
The closest historical parallel we have is the global economic system. But think about the difference. With the economy, we have 250 years of academic study, robust public data, and transparent metrics like GDP and inflation to help us regulate it.
With social media, it's a closed ecosystem. The tech giants hold all the data hostage. We are trying to regulate a massive, chaotic, society-altering engine while completely blindfolded.
It is a phenomenal challenge.
It's frankly terrifying when you put it like that. So, let's recap where we are. We have journeyed through the hidden time pockets of the traumatized individual mind. We've seen the rigid us versus them categorizations constructed by traditional media, and now we've navigated the algorithmically optimized hostility of the digital public square driven by a toxic 1%.
That's a lot.
It feels like we are completely hopelessly boxed in by systems that distort reality at every level. So how do we get out? How do we, as individuals and as a broader society, break free from these rigid, toxic, exhausting structures?
This brings us to the final, most hopeful part of our deep dive, reclaiming reality.
Oh, thank goodness. We needed some hope.
Yes. The source materials point very clearly toward two vital antidotes to everything we've discussed, trustworthy knowledge and unmeasurable creativity. And to explore this, we are drawing from the Folkeuniversitet catalog, featuring the insights of two brilliant Danish professors, Professor Anja Beckman and Professor Leen Tangard.
Let's start with the knowledge aspect, because we just talked about how algorithms breed cynicism. Professor Beckman talks about the urgent need for what she calls lighthouses. And this feels so relevant right now.
It really does.
We are entering an era of rapidly improving artificial intelligence and synthetic media. We are already seeing highly convincing deepfakes, AI-generated images that look totally real, completely synthetic news articles written by bots.
The information environment is about to become exponentially more polluted.
Exactly. And when you reach a point where you literally cannot trust your own eyes or ears, there is a massive risk that the general public becomes entirely cynical and just dismisses everything as fake. We just give up.
To combat that impending darkness, Beckman argues we desperately need lighthouses, or fyrtårn in Danish. These are established institutions of quality-assured, deeply curated, trustworthy knowledge.
Places we can actually trust.
They are beacons we can look to when the sea of information gets too stormy. She specifically points to the National Encyclopedia in Denmark, lex.dk, which is maintained by over 900 verified researchers and professionals. She also points to the Folkeuniversitet itself, which brings university-level peer-reviewed research directly to the public.
Looking at the actual Folkeuniversitet catalog provided in the sources, you can really see what these lighthouses look like in practice. They aren't offering quick 30-second hot takes or angry algorithmic reactions.
No, not at all.
They're offering deep, structured, deliberate learning. There are courses at the Copenhagen Business School on Hannah Arendt's philosophy and her thoughts on the fundamental conditions of human existence. There's a fascinating course analyzing how Hollywood movies have actively shaped the historical narrative of the United States.
And practical subjects, too.
Yeah. There are dense lectures on the hidden mechanics of global tax havens and the very real technical threats of cybersecurity.
This is slow knowledge. It is deliberate, contextual knowledge meant to anchor us. These lighthouses provide the essential context and nuance that social media algorithms actively strip away.
But the sources also make it clear that knowledge alone isn't quite enough. Knowing the facts helps us navigate the rigid structures of society, but we also need the ability to imagine entirely new structures.
Right.
We need a way to break out of the boxes completely, and that requires a deep understanding of what creativity actually is.
Yes. Professor Leen Tangard's work on the anatomy of creativity is a true revelation. I think most people in society view creativity as this chaotic, magical spark that just strikes certain artistic geniuses out of nowhere. We treat it like a superpower you were either born with or you aren't.
Right, like you're either a creative person or a math person.
But Tangard, who has spent 25 years deeply researching this exact topic, completely flips that on its head.
Yeah.
She defines creativity fundamentally as a craft. It is something you work at.
It beautifully demystifies the entire process. She breaks down the anatomy of creativity into 3 core components.
Let's go through them.
First, and this connects back to the lighthouses, is deep knowledge. The most creative people in history knew their field intimately before they revolutionized it. Tangard argues you have to deeply know the old in order to be able to recognize the new.
That makes a lot of sense. You can't reinvent the wheel if you don't know what a wheel is.
Exactly. You can't break the rules effectively until you've completely mastered them. Like, Picasso mastered classical, realistic portraiture before he ever started rearranging eyes and noses on the canvas. He knew the box before he stepped out of it.
Precisely. The second component Tangard identifies is courage. But she describes it in this wonderful, very relatable way. She calls it the Pippi Longstocking mindset.
I love this. I haven't tried this before, so I must be incredibly good at it.
Exactly. It's an aggressive, playful optimism in the face of the unknown. It is the courage to experiment without a guarantee of success. And the third component, which is vital in our current systems, is resilience.
Because people are going to push back.
Oh, heavily. Tangard notes that truly creative people, the ones who actually change paradigms, encounter immense resistance and rejection.
Why? Why does society reject them so harshly?
Because when you introduce something genuinely new, the existing system, which, as we've discussed, is built entirely on neat categories, precedents, and historical metrics, will naturally reject it. It doesn't compute.
Right. The system tries to force the new idea into an old box.
Exactly. So as a creative person, you have to have the fortitude to ignore the no's, to ignore the bad grades or the failed metrics, because you believe you have found something fundamentally true.
And this leads directly to her major critique of modern society, which I think is one of the most powerful concepts in this entire deep dive. She calls it the measure way ideology, or mola vege ideology.
This is the crux of why creativity is struggling today.
Let me break this down because it resonated so much. We've become a society utterly obsessed with metrics. We test kids in school constantly with standardized exams. We measure employee productivity with keystroke trackers. We evaluate hospitals based on patient turnaround times.
Everything has to be quantified.
We try to measure everything that can possibly be put into an Excel spreadsheet.
But the profound danger of the measure way ideology is that it limits our entire perception of reality to only that which is easily quantifiable. Tangard argues passionately that measuring only what can be measured actively prevents real, human, community-oriented development.
If you only value what you can weigh, you discard everything else as worthless.
Precisely. She gives this amazing real-world example in the source material that proves her point perfectly. It's about a project called The Nest at a school in Aarhus.
Oh, this story is incredible.
This school decided to integrate autistic children and non-autistic children into the exact same classes. Now think about traditional logic. The measurement logic, the way we've designed most education systems would say, no, absolutely not. Separate them.
Right. Put the high-performing kids in an elite track so they can excel. Put the autistic kids in a highly specialized track so we can measure their progress on separate, clean, standardized curves.
The traditional system wants neat categories. But the school leaders behind the Nest project did the exact opposite of what traditional categorization dictates. They thought to the edges of the box. They possessed that Pippi Longstocking courage.
And the results?
It was a massive success. The demand from parents of non-autistic children to get into this integrated school became enormous.
But here is the critical takeaway. The profound social, emotional, and developmental success of that integration, the empathy those kids learned, the unique ways they solved problems together cannot be easily captured by a standardized math test.
It completely evades the metrics.
If you only use the measure way ideology, you might deem the project a failure because the test scores didn't look like a standard bell curve. You'd completely miss the human triumph.
Tangard brings up another stunning example. Jens Christian Skou, the Danish doctor who won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1997. Skou explicitly stated that he would never have won his Nobel Prize if he had been forced to live up to the rigid measurement regimes, the constant grant applications, and the publication quotas of today's academic environments.
He needed space to be creative?
His specific creative process needed vast amounts of unstructured time, quiet space, and a total freedom from constant metric-based evaluation. The system we have built today would have measured him, found him lacking in short-term output, and fired him before he made his world-changing discovery.
When you tie all of this together, the grand pattern of our entire deep dive just clicks into place. Think about it. The media frames we discussed earlier with Faru Yilmaz boxing minorities into neat ethnic or modern categories, that is just a form of the measure way ideology applied to human identity.
Yes, it is.
And the social media algorithms prioritizing that tiny 1% of hostile users just to maximize engagement metrics, that is the measure way ideology weaponized against our biology.
Oh, really?
They are all systems, whether it's a newspaper editor, a tech CEO, or a school board, trying to force the messy, unquantifiable, complex reality of human life into neat, quantifiable boxes.
That is the perfect synthesis.
It's like trying to judge a beautiful, breathtaking, complex piece of music by just taking the physical sheet music and putting it on a kitchen scale.
I love that image.
You're measuring something, sure. You can confidently say the song weighs 3 ounces, but you're completely, entirely missing the magic of the song. You're missing the resonance, the emotional impact, the space between the notes. True creativity is the antidote to this rigid categorization. It is the absolute refusal to be weighed.
And that ultimately is why understanding the inner architecture of the mind, where we started this journey, is so profoundly crucial. Because creativity requires massive amounts of internal energy. It requires exactly the kind of life energy that gets locked away when we are traumatized.
Oh, I see how it all connects now.
If an individual's internal system is bound up in time pockets, using all of its daily resources just to suppress the unbearable imprints of the past, that mind has absolutely nothing left in the tank for the Pippi Longstocking courage needed to challenge the external systems of society.
Wow.
Healing trauma isn't just about finding individual relief from migraines and nightmares. It frees the mind to actually act creatively upon the world.
Okay, that is a lot to process, but it is incredibly powerful. Let's bring this all the way home. We have journeyed through some incredibly dense, paradigm-shifting material today.
We really have.
We started in the darkest, most hidden vaults of the mind, looking at the time pockets we construct to survive the unbearable imprints of trauma. We saw how those internal filtering mechanisms perfectly mirror the artificial us versus them pockets that our society constructs through subtle media framing, essentializing entire groups of people.
We ventured into the chaotic digital stadium, where we learned that the terrifying, overwhelming hostility of social media is largely an illusion, a distortion created by a 1% minority exploiting our ancient biological negativity bias, amplified by algorithms designed only to measure engagement.
And most importantly, we mapped the escape routes. We saw that the way out of this exhausting hall of mirrors is by actively seeking out those lighthouses of truth, deep, quality-assured knowledge, and by cultivating the craft of true creativity.
Yes.
By refusing to let our lives, our schools, and our societies be dictated by spreadsheets, algorithms, and rigid measurements. And this is where it all comes back to you, the person listening to this deep dive right now. Knowing that these invisible forces exist gives you incredible power.
It really does.
Whether it's recognizing an unhealed imprint in your own mind that's draining your energy, or spotting a subtle media frame on the evening news that's trying to build a wall between us and them, or just realizing that your doom scrolling is just an algorithm trying to feed on your attention. That awareness is the very first step out of the box. It gives you the space to apply true, unmeasurable creativity to your own life.
It absolutely does. And as we conclude our analysis of these sources, this raises one final important question that connects all of these threads together.
I'm ready. What is it?
If our biological brains are hardwired to pay attention to danger, to focus on conflict, and to prioritize the safety of our group over outsiders, which is exactly what the media and the algorithms exploit to keep us engaged, and if true creativity requires us to step boldly into the unknown, to ignore resistance, and to actively break down those very categories.
Yeah.
Is the act of creativity actually a biological rebellion against our own basic survival instincts?
Wow. That is something incredibly profound to chew on. We started today looking for the clean, jagged line on the X-ray, and we ended up realizing that the muddy waters are where the real magic happens. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the editing room of reality. Keep questioning the framing, find your lighthouses, and we will catch you next time.